In 1991, former Commissioner of Social Security Dorcas Hardy wrote this book to explain how Social Security works and to attempt to explode some of the myths that people have come to believe. In her first chapter on the history of Social Security, Hardy drew heavily on an earlier book written in 1979 by Martha Durthick. Further attempts have been made over the years to try and educate people about this system. Here's an article written in 2003 by the late John Atarian. None of these attempts to overcome the misperceptions created by the Roosevelt administration in 1935 have been successful. Americans today still cling to the myths that Social Security is insurance, under which workers pay contributions or premiums to receive guaranteed benefits that, being paid for, are theirs as a matter of earned right, and that Social Security is a social contract between the generations. This presentation will try once again to explain what Social Security is and isn't, as well as to illustrate how this program fits into the overall debt picture facing the United States. It should also be a cautionary tale for both individuals and local governments. First, we can do away with the myth of the social contract. There was never any contract made, between the generations or otherwise. Workers in the early 30s didn't rise up in anger and demand of Congress that they believe the government should take care of them in their old age. Congress simply passed a law, enacting a program that Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted. But Section 1104 of the original Act, which has never been amended, says that Congress can do anything it wants with Social Security. This was proven in the case of Fleming versus Nestor in 1960. Ephraim Nestor was a Bulgarian who came to America in 1913 and lived here continuously for 43 years. For 19 years, Nestor and his employers had made regular payments into the Social Security system. In 1955, he became eligible and began receiving payments from Social Security. Then, in July 1956, he was deported for having been a communist from 1933 to 1939, a period of time during which membership in the Communist Party as such was not illegal and wasn't even statutory ground for deportation. When he was deported, the government cut off his Social Security payments. Nestor sued, and Nestor lost. The case, upheld by the Supreme Court, established the principle that entitlement to Social Security benefits is not a contractual right. So much for the myth of the social contract. The program began in 1936, establishing a system of old age benefits for workers. The system is nationwide, federally administered, compulsory, and contributory. It originally was to begin payments in 1942. When it began, Social Security was a startling innovation in America. It ran strongly against even middle-of-the-road opinion in this country, which still held to the belief in rugged individualism. The moral standard of the time was to never be a burden on anyone, which included not accepting favors unless absolutely necessary. But it was also an article of faith that one should offer to help where needed, even if one did not have much to give. Since the country's founding, care of the aged had always been the responsibility of the family and private voluntary charitable giving. Few outside the realm of the intellectual elite in the 30s believed that it was the government's job to take on this responsibility. Well, FDR realized that the program ran against the grain of the electorate. That is why he did what he did. It had to be sold to the American people and to Congress. It was sold as an insurance program. Insurance was the central symbol of all the messages. It was stressed precisely because it was expected to secure public acceptance. Because insurance implied a return for work and investment, it preserved the self-respect of both the contributors and the beneficiaries. Because it implied a return in proportion to a person's investment, it satisfied a widely held conception of fairness. And because it implied the existence of a contract, it appeared sound and certain. Taxes became premiums or contributions. Workers were told they would have old age accounts in Baltimore. They were paying for their own protection, building up insurance for their old age. Anyone who dared to challenge the insurance analogy or resist using the preferred terms was immediately branded as an enemy of the program. Here is how it was explained in a brochure provided to all workers. Quote, beginning November 24, 1936, the United States government will set up a Social Security account for you if you are eligible. The United States government will send checks every month to retired workers, both men and women, after they have passed their 65th birthday and have met a few simple requirements of the law. The checks will come to you as a right." Unquote. So here we have implanted in people's minds that this is that earned right that was mentioned earlier. Here is a visual depiction of what the American people were told. Workers W, X, Y, and Z have accounts established in Baltimore. During their working days, they pay their taxes or premiums which go into their account. The government pays interest on this money while it's sitting in the account. Upon retirement, the citizen receives all his money plus the interest it has earned all those years. If one listens to a spokesperson for the AARP today, this is exactly how they describe Social Security. Of course, that belief is based on what their parents were told in the 30s and how they came to understand it. Well, it's all hogwash. Those accounts never existed. In 1939, before one benefit check had ever been paid, Congress did away with those accounts and made the program a pay-as-you-go system. What this means is that current benefits are paid out of current tax receipts. But when the amount being taken into the system exceeds what is needed to pay out current benefits, what happens to the excess? We'll get to that in a few moments. Instead of a system of retirement insurance, Social Security became a wealth transfer from the young to the old, and this is what it has been ever since. But through all this, the basic thrust of the sales campaign did not change. The language of insurance and contributions provided political cover to get the American people to buy into it. In the 30s, it seemed that such a wealth transfer program could work. After all, there were many more workers than there were retired people. And, as a general rule, old people didn't live long anyway. In 1936, the average life expectancy was as shown here. The charade of individual Social Security accounts gave every taxpayer a sense of ownership in the program. At one point, an aide suggested to Roosevelt that the new auditors and accountants in the Social Security Administration were just wasting their time keeping track of each individual's contributions and their retirement accounts. Roosevelt replied, quote, "That account is not useless. That account is not there to determine how much should be paid out and to control what should be paid out. That account is there so those sons of bitches on Capitol Hill can't ever abandon this system after I'm gone." Unquote. To illustrate the fallacy of a retirement account in which you pay into the system and then receive your money plus interest, we'll use the case of Ida Mae Fuller, the very first recipient of a Social Security check. Mrs. Fuller was a law clerk who paid into the system 3 years, 1936 until her retirement in 1939. In all, she paid in $24.75. She received the first check on January 31, 1940. She continued to receive benefits for the next 35 years until her death at age 99. By the time of her death, she had received $22,888.92. I will leave it to a mathematician to try and figure out what interest rate her $24.75 had to receive over that period of time to pay out that much money. But the interest rate on government bonds in 1940 was 1.4%. I believe this makes it clear that Mrs. Fuller's benefits were actually being paid by the contributions of workers all those years. That is the reality of how Social Security has worked since it started. A few moments ago I said we'd come back to the issue of what is done with the money that's in excess of what is needed to pay out current benefits. It is paid to the U.S. Treasury, which issues special purpose bonds, or IOUs, that are then held by the trust fund to be redeemed for cash in the future when current receipts are not enough to pay out current benefits. What does the Treasury then do with that money? Well, it spends it on all the other things that government does every day. Things like fighting wars, farm subsidies, and food stamps. Those who are old enough will remember how Ronald Reagan was attacked in the 80s for borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. Well, that is what every president before and since Reagan has done, starting with FDR. Borrow from the trust fund. That's the way the program has worked from the very start. We'll return to the discussion of the excess or so-called surplus in a few minutes. For now, we'll go back and continue with a bit more history. With the end of World War II came a technological revolution coupled with major advances in health. People started living longer. The percentage of older persons receiving benefits skyrocketed from 16% in 1950 to 82% in 1970 to 90% in 1980. Life expectancy by 1980 had increased tremendously from what it had been in 1936. Meanwhile, Social Security taxes stayed low, and the amount of income subject to the tax also stayed low. With taxes at such low levels, any discussion of Social Security at all focused on benefits. That's where the votes were to be had. In 1950, there were 16 workers for every Social Security recipient. Because there were so many more workers than retirees, benefits began to be raised. Congress enacted the first benefit increase, raising benefits 77%, and expanded the list of industries brought under the system. Beginning in the 70s, however, changes in the underlying demographic and economic trends brought Social Security into a new era. By 1970, that ratio of workers to retirees had dropped from 16-1 to a little more than 3-1. This was an era where both taxes and benefits were both on the political agenda. And after decades of rapid economic growth and low inflation, suddenly in the 70s, growth slowed and prices took off. The Social Security Administration had continued to make its projections on the assumption that wages would continue to increase more rapidly than prices. As events proved this assumption to be incorrect, the projections were recalculated and the new forecasts showed that the system was in real trouble. Congress faced the inevitable and virtually doubled the taxes. Now remember, there are two components to the tax you pay, not only the rate, but also the amount of your salary on which the tax is due. This shows what has happened to both tax rates and salary amounts since 1981. At the time, Congress said that this would put the system on a sound footing for 50 years. Well, predicting the future is always a risky business. The health of Social Security rests on underlying factors that can and do change. If those factors change enough, then the program must change as well. In the early years of the program, the underlying factors, demographics, and the economy were favorable. Changes in the system were positive. They postponed the first tax increase from 1940 to 1950. They moved the first payments from 1942 to 1940. By the 80s, however, the underlying factors that had worked for the system in the early years were working against it. The early 80s found the country in a very serious economic downturn. Employment was way down, and the Social Security tax revenues were missing their targets. For the 5 years ending in 1982, the actuarial projections had been for 28% cumulative increase in inflation. It was actually more than 50%. Real wages were projected to rise by 3%. They fell by 7%. Unemployment was expected to be around 5.9%. It was 7%. Confronted with the crisis nature of the system, in May 1981, President Ronald Reagan proposed cutting benefits to end the crisis. The proposal included a reduction in early retirement benefits, benefits which persons can collect if they retire before the normal retirement age. This reduction proposal was to cut the benefit from 80% of the normal benefit to 55%. Attacks on Reagan's proposals erupted immediately. Perpetuating the myths, Democrats in Congress flayed Reagan, declaring that benefits are a right, an earned right, that he was guilty of breaching a contract, that Social Security is bought and paid for by the hard labor of the American worker, and so on. Confronted with such violent opposition, Reagan appointed a commission to study the issue and recommend changes. In 1983, Congress raised Social Security taxes and reduced future benefits by raising the retirement age and trimming early retirement benefits after the year 2000. Recall Section 1104. So much for the contract. Well, in January 1993, the new Clinton administration proposed reducing the deficit by freezing Social Security COLAs and was violently condemned by the AARP. As a witness for the myth, New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan called it, quote, unacceptable, unquote, since it would weaken the idea that Social Security is insurance. He said, quote, we should acknowledge that this is a contributory insurance program. These monies are held in trust. It's paid up insurance, unquote. Representative Newt Gingrich called Social Security a, quote, contract, unquote, and vowed to, quote, keep the Democrats from tampering with it, unquote. Well, President Clinton reversed himself, told the AARP's leadership he believes Social Security is a special contract with the elderly, explicitly affirming Social Security's myths, and he dropped the COLA freeze idea. Interestingly enough, after Moynihan left office in 2000, he agreed to serve as co-chairman of President George Bush's bipartisan commission to strengthen Social Security. No longer needing to beg for votes for re-election, Moynihan dropped the pretense of believing and perpetuating the myths. He saw Social Security reform as an opportunity to give ordinary working Americans an opportunity to save and invest the same way that higher income people can. He called it a measure of wealth. He understood that wealth in America no longer comes exclusively or even primarily from wages, but from investment. Roughly 52% of Americans now invest privately. But nearly half of Americans, mostly low and middle income workers, still are not able to participate in this route to financial wealth. This is not surprising. After paying for food, rent, medical care, and other expenses of daily living, many Americans simply don't have much money left over to save and invest. That is why Moynihan supported proposals to allow younger workers to privately invest a portion of their Social Security taxes through individual accounts. This was a proposal that never went anywhere, but for which George Bush was attacked by Democrats in Congress and by the AARP for daring to tamper with Social Security. The hypocrisy of politicians can sometimes seem boundless. In any event, back in '83, the Commission made a number of recommendations that Congress adopted. They trimmed benefits slightly and delayed that year's cost of living increase by 6 months. And for the first time, they added provisions in the income tax code to begin taxing the Social Security benefits of retirees with high incomes. Let's see just how high that income must be. Here's the calculation that must be done. If the total of 1 and 2 exceeds the amount shown, then you must pay income tax on your Social Security benefits. So this is how rich you must be to pay income tax on your Social Security. And this is what is meant by the marriage penalty. One would think that a married couple would get a threshold amount double that of a single person, or $50,000. Not so. In any event, the proposals recommended by Reagan's commission were passed into law by Congress in 1983. The result was massive surpluses at least through 1991. However, those surpluses projected in 1983 were set to run out in 2010. But as we saw earlier, there never really was a surplus, because the excess money was exchanged with the Treasury for IOUs. These IOUs are in the form of what are called special purpose bonds. They are issued only to the Social Security Administration and are not marketable anywhere else. These bonds are supposed to pay interest. If the federal government wasn't running a deficit, the bonds would, in fact, constitute a reserve that could be redeemed to pay benefits. However, because the government is running a deficit, the Treasury is not only having to borrow money to keep the government running, it must also borrow money to redeem those special purpose bonds in the Social Security Fund. So, exactly how much money is represented by those IOUs today? As of June 2013, this amounted to $9.6 trillion, or $83,894 per household in America. Ever wonder what $1 trillion looks like? Here we have a $100 bill, the largest denomination of currency in America today. And here we have enough $100 bills banded together to make 10,000. Band and stack enough of them, and you have $1 million. 90 years of work for the average human being. This is $100 million. Sitting on a standard pallet, it's not quite as tall as the average person. $1 billion. Now we're getting serious. And here's what $1 trillion looks like. This is how much the U.S. government borrowed in 2010 alone. Now keep in mind, these are double-stacked pallets of $100 million each, full of $100 bills. You'd need a lot of 18-wheelers to carry this. If you spent $1 million a day since Jesus was born, you would not have spent $1 trillion by now. By Christmas of 2011, the U.S. debt had already exceeded $15 trillion. And this is only the debt run up to run the government. It does not count the debt held in Social Security and Medicare, the Medicare prescription drug program, as well as military and civil servant retirement programs. Look to the far right, and you'll see that the mountain of debt dwarfs what used to be the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Hopefully by now you understand that the myth of the retiree receiving all the money he paid into the system plus interest is completely false. There are no retirement accounts into which interest could be paid. There never were. All a person gets back is the money he or she paid into the system. On average, it takes a person approximately 6 to 7 years to receive this amount. If they live longer, they are then living off the efforts of current workers who pay their benefits for the rest of their lives. But even if there were such an account, the government can't pay any interest. It's borrowing more and more every day just to keep things going. The credit rating of the United States has already been lowered. Other countries are no longer willing to loan us money. With quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve has created money out of thin air to stimulate the economy. But this results in inflation, too much money chasing too few goods and services. We've all seen how much prices have risen in the last 2 years, and they keep right on rising. What can be done? We have reached a point where absolutely nothing can be done. As far as Social Security is concerned, the power of the senior citizen lobby, all of whom grew up believing the myth, is simply too strong. A politician tampers with Social Security at his peril. There will come a triggering point sometime in the near future when the entire economy of the United States will collapse. Or the Federal Reserve will continue printing money and thus devaluing the currency. This will lead to hyperinflation, where it takes a wheelbarrow load of money to buy a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk, as it did in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s. Those still alive today who lived through the Great Depression are now in their 80s and 90s. But they were children during the Depression. All they can tell us is things were very bad. They can't tell us how they got that way in the 20s. They got that way by people and the government spending money they didn't have, just as is happening today on a much larger scale. As was noted at the beginning, this should be a cautionary tale for both individuals and local governments. The world economy is even more interconnected today than it was in the 20s. The trigger that causes the collapse could be an event outside the United States over which we have no control. Most are familiar with the situation in Detroit. Since 1937, there have been over 600 Chapter 9 bankruptcies of cities, towns, villages, counties, and special purpose districts in the United States. It is the height of irresponsibility to continue doing business as it has been done before, based on the assumption that things will continue as they have before. Incurring new debt at a time when the federal government is in such a precarious financial condition is folly. The burden of unfunded mandates levied by the federal government on the states and by the states down to the local governments is greater than ever. Local governments, assuming they can continue to rely on a stable property tax base, is completely irrational and unjustified. At the worst point in the Depression-era economic crisis in 1933, 1,000 home loans were being foreclosed by banks every day. But what if there's no bank to pay the property taxes on the foreclosed property? At the peak of business in mid-1929, nearly 25,000 commercial banks were in operation in the United States. By early 1933, that number was down to 18,000. When the banking holiday called by Roosevelt upon his inauguration ended, fewer than 12,000 banks were permitted to open, and only 3,000 additional banks were later permitted to do so. As Social Security fails, many senior citizens will be left destitute, unable to pay their property taxes. As prices rise, businesses will begin laying off workers who will likewise be unable to pay property taxes. As sales fall due to lack of income, businesses will fail and sales tax receipts will dwindle. Social Security was a well-intentioned attempt to ensure the elderly had a chance to live a reasonably comfortable life in their old age. But by creating a false consciousness about what Social Security was and how it worked, Roosevelt's falsehoods served to ensure that the program could not be altered in any meaningful way. That's what Roosevelt wanted, and that's what he got.